Hey, I thought an interesting topic for this video would be World War Three. World War Three. Um, Ever since the Paris attacks, there has occasionally been this sort of discourse going on from some sources, especially in the States, that this marks the beginning of World War Three. I didn't see his quote directly, so I can't say it's directly attributed to him, but there was also um, a paraphrase from Pope Francis saying that this marked a sort of Third World War. So if that's accurate, then it comes from right and arguably left-wing sources as well. Um, I'll say off the cuff, I'm skeptical of the notion of this marking World War Three. We have to put things in context. What happened in Paris was a major terrorist attack, and whilst it is right that there is a major response to that, and whilst it is right that people are talking about it, and whilst it is right that people are concerned, in my opinion, it definitely doesn't mark the beginning of World War Three. It wasn't a nuclear attack, and it wasn't an attack of one nation state against another. Islamic State may call themselves a state, but no one in the world is going to recognize them except fellow jihadists. And even fellow jihadists, I mean, Al Qaeda, from what I understand, is no fans of Daesh. So they'll never ever achieve a united caliphate stretching from well, essentially from the Philippines to North Africa, which is their ambition. It's never going to happen because there'll simply be too much opposition. Because even if the opposition doesn't agree with each other, they'll never, ever, ever accept Islamic State. That's the good news. But regarding World War Three, I think it's important that we define what a world war is. Um, I actually do believe that the fight against Islamism is a global war, but I'm not sure if that is the same as a world war. Global war insofar as it spreads across the world. But anyway, I'll come to that in a second. Um, let's look at what is defined as a world war. So far, there's only two major events that are generally recognized as world wars. That was World War One, 1914 to 1918, or 1919, depending on how you look at it, and World War Two, 39 to 45. And again, the origins of that begin in the Second Sino-Japanese War. But generally speaking, those two conflicts are universally recognized as the two world wars. But there has been certain academic debate and speculation and opinion that would suggest that there were other conflicts that can also be seen as world wars. And none other than Winston Churchill himself actually put the title World Wars to some of these conflicts. And that would radically change how we define the two conflicts I've just named. So, if we recognize a world war to be a major conflict involving mass casualties, involving total war, that is every aspect of the population involved, and mass damage between nation states, across continents, then arguably the first global war, the First World War, would be the Seven Years' War from 1757 to 1764. That would be the world's first world war, technically. And I believe it was Churchill that coined that associated that as being the first global war. It was fought in three continents. It was fought mostly in Europe, but also a lot of fighting in North America. And in Asia, the Battle of Plassey between the British Empire and the French Empire was a real turning point. Actually, it was the British East India Company, but that was seen as a major battle. I've actually got a book entirely dedicated to the year 1757, because that was seen as a year, at least in British history, as important as 1815 or 1066. Um, so, in that sense, the Seven Years' War was the first global conflict. It was a costly war. Casualties are variously estimated between 1.5 million to about 2.5 million. Not comparable to, what we see as World War One and World War Two, but nevertheless a major conflict. The 30 Years' War before that in Europe from now I forget off the top of my head the exact years of that, but it was the first half of the 17th century, was a devastating conflict in Europe. Some academic opinion puts the number of fatalities of that conflict at 8 million. Um, but I'm not sure if the 30 Years' War spread beyond Europe. So it was certainly the first major European war involving all the great powers of Europe. The Hundred Years' War between Britain and France was a pretty major conflict, but I don't think we can class that as a Europe-wide conflict. So the first Europe-wide conflict in that sense would be the 30 Years' War. Um, I mean, with 8 million fatalities, that was a massive, massive conflict. However, it was over 30 years, which was a much, much broader time period than the First World War and the Second World War. Um, the Dutch Revolt from, I believe it was 1548 to 1628, or 1568 to 1648, I'm not quite sure about the exact years, was also a major conflict involving all the European powers of the day. So there we have several major conflicts already before the First World War. Another conflict that I think would have a very strong claim would be the Great French War, which is not a term that is widely used, but it is a term that's used to collectively describe the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars between 1792 and 1815, approximately. Certainly in terms of casualties, it was a major, major series of conflicts, wasn't one conflict, because you had various conflicts like the wars of the Fourth Coalition, the Fifth Coalition, the Sixth Coalition, the Peninsular War, and so on. Um, the casualties from the Napoleonic Wars are estimated about 3.5 million. I can't find any figures for the French Revolutionary Wars, but would certainly be well over a million. So collectively, we're talking between 5 and 6 million fatalities in the Great French War. Um, and there was fighting outside Europe. There was fighting off the coast of South America, in North Africa. So again, that would have a fair claim to being a global conflict. Um, there's been conflicts within China that are amongst the most deadly in history, but they can't really be classed as global conflicts because they were civil wars within China. The Yan Lushan rebellion during the Tang Dynasty may have killed as many as 30 million people, which was even more devastating than the First World War. The Taiping Rebellion, another very devastating civil war. France and Britain were involved in that conflict. Um, most conflicts that happen within China are very bloody simply because the sheer number of people that are within China. The Boxer Rebellion was another one. Um, the the Qing conquest of the Ming Dynasty. You know, if you look at Chinese history, there's many, many conflicts. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, the Donggan Revolt. Any one of those cost millions of lives, but they're generally not that well known in the West because they were civil wars, and for the most part, with the exception of those that occurred in the later Qing Dynasty, they were internal. I mean, people in the Western world wouldn't have known anything about the Yan Lushan when it was going on, because China hadn't even been, discovered by Westerners at that point. Discovered in the sense of, the Westerners knew about it. Um, so if we go by Churchill's definition, the Seven Years' War was the first global conflict. Also, what I didn't mention was the War of the Austrian Succession and the War of the Spanish Succession. They were also major conflicts that involved all the great European powers, and unless I'm mistaken, the wars fighting in North America as well. Um, the Seven Years' War, incidentally, I believe the French and Indian Wars took place in North America. They were part of that war. Queen Anne's War also took place in North America. The Last of the Mohicans, that film is set during the Seven Years' War. So if we go by Churchill's definition, the First World War, the first global war, was the Seven Years' War. The second global war, under this sort of understanding, would be the Great French War, which would mean that there was other major conflicts, of course, since then. Between that is the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War. There was the Franco-Prussian War, the American Civil War, the Crimean War. I'm not sure if any of those could be comparable to the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. So let's say between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War as we know it, um, that would then mean that the First World War is actually the Third World War. The Second World War, as we know it, and I'm not including the Russian Civil War and the Chinese Civil War, because whilst there were outside factions involved, they were large civil wars, nor am I including the Spanish Civil War. By this understanding, the Fourth World War is what we know as the Second World War. There has been many who have called the Cold War the Third World War, but under this logic, that is the 7 Years' War being the First World War, then we come to the Cold War, that would be the Fifth World War. So, if we go by that understanding, if there is a global war going on now, then we're actually in the Sixth World War under that understanding. And that brings me up to the present time. Firstly, if we go by fatalities, what we're seeing in the world today doesn't even come close to previous global conflicts. It doesn't even come close. And that is not to underplay it. That's not to say that it's not a serious situation. And it's not to say that it isn't a worldwide phenomenon, because it is. But the fact is that more people worldwide died from armed conflict in the period from the 1960s to the 1990s. You could take any year between the 1960s and the 1990s, and almost every year in that time had a higher death toll than any year in the past 10 years. And this is something I have spent some time studying. So in that sense, in terms of the casualties, and this is not to underplay or trivialize anything that's going on, but it is a simple reality. The deadliest conflict in the world today is the Syrian civil war, which is a horrible situation. But that's the deadliest conflict in the world in the past 10 years, pretty much. 300,000 dead. Now, let's even compare that to the 1990s. The 1990s, there was a Rwandan genocide, 1 million dead. There was the Liberian Civil War, the Sierra Leone Civil War, um, the Algerian Civil War. All of those conflicts were at least as bad as the Syrian Civil War today, the Bosnian War for that matter. So, certainly compared to the 1990s, we are not living in as violent a world as the world was then. That is not to underplay what's happening. But I do think there is a tendency that whenever anything major happens, immediately the response is, oh, it must be World War III. The truth is, there's been many times since 1945 where there has been that fear. The Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, 1983, which is less known than the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that was also a point where the world came dangerously close to nuclear war. That was, unless I'm mistaken, the point where both the Soviet Union and the United States had their peak of nuclear weapons. Every time North Korea's test fired a missile, there's been fears of World War III. This goes back quite a long way. It's nothing new. I'm sure after the Madrid bombings, people were saying the same thing. I'm sure after the Mumbai bombings, people were saying the same thing. Um, you know, when the Cold War ended, broadly speaking, when the Berlin Wall came down, there was a brief period of optimism, but then we started to see brutal and bloody civil wars going on throughout the 1990s. Chechnya, Bosnia, Liberia, and so on. Um, Plato said only the dead have seen the end of war, and sadly he may have been right. Um, I think there'll always be dramatic situations in this world. In terms of this being a global situation, in that sense, it is a global war um, because it is a worldwide problem, and it's a problem that is facing the whole world. But terrorist organizations, no matter how ruthless, sadistic they are not the same as nation states. And that's fundamentally the difference with warfare today. There's actually very, very few wars in the world today that are between nation states. The only example I can think of in recent years is the Russia Ukraine conflict. And even there, whilst Russia is unquestionably involved, it's Russian mercenaries as opposed to outright Russia versus Ukraine. But that's the only example I can think of. Um, Most of the wars in the world today are civil wars or insurgencies, that is, terrorist groups versus a nation state. I can't think of any conflict in the world today, major conflict, that is between nation states. But that doesn't mean that there isn't volatile situations. If we look at the South China Sea, that's always volatile. India, Pakistan is always volatile. North Korea is always volatile. These are all situations, Russia and Eastern Europe, to cite another example. These are all, any one of these situations, Iran, and incidentally with Iran, I think that's eased a little bit because I believe that President Rouhani, and this is not an endorsement of him, but I believe he is more moderate than Ahmadinejad, at least more willing to talk to the West, and the West is more willing to talk to him. So the truth is, the world is in a very volatile situation right now. There's no question about that. With Arab winter, i.e., post-Arab Spring, we have been seeing some very bloody conflicts in the Middle East. The Middle East, the truth is, it's always been a tinderbox, always. I can't think of any time in the last 50 years where the Middle East hasn't been volatile. All the time we hear that Israel's going to go to war with Iran, or Saudi Arabia and Iran are going to go to war, or we hear this all the time. And what usually happens is there is a conflict, but it never quite transcends into outright nation states versus nation states. And that is the fundamental difference with the world today and the world during World War II. That doesn't mean that it's less of a problem, because in some ways it's more complicated today because instead of dealing with nation states, you're dealing with terrorist organizations that are murky, um, that hide behind the shadows. It is a different nature of conflict, but I think we have to be wary of talking about World War III every time a major situation happens. And what happened in Paris was certainly a major situation, but I don't believe it marks the beginning of World War III. I think the only way we're going to see the beginning of an actual World War III comparable to World War II is if a great power attacks a great power. And by great powers, I mean countries like the United States, France, Britain, Japan, China, India, Germany, Brazil. Um, if any one of those countries attacks another one, then I think we might be in the beginning of World War III. So far, that hasn't happened, and I don't think it will. If we look at the Pacific Theater, for example, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of angry talk between China and Japan, but then what usually happens is it gets blown up, then it eases a little bit, there's some compromise. I think it's a lot of hot air, to be honest, and that doesn't mean that I'm saying it's not serious, but I just think we have to be wary about talking about World War III because people have been talking about World War III for years, and it hasn't materialized to the point of it being like World War II. I mean, to put things in context, 129 people died in Paris. Very serious. And I'm not taking that away for a second. But 129 people would have been 10 minutes in the Western Front of World War One. 10 minutes. 129 people would have been a single air raid in London during World War Two. So, of course, it's right that we are shocked and angered by what's happened, but it isn't also important to put things in context. And I'll leave it there. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think this marks the beginning of World War III? If so, why? Or do you agree with me? Do you think that we need to be careful with this sort of rhetoric? And a final word, I'm not downplaying anything here because I do believe that we face a global war. But what I'm saying is I don't think it is the same as a world war in the sense of World War One, World War Two.